The contradiction arrived before the first defense ever could. The public story kept insisting there was nothing to see, nothing to connect, nothing unusual about a senior White House advisor carrying a famous surname, holding foreign trademarks, keeping hotel income, navigating international deals, and later stepping into a courtroom to say she was never really inside the financial machinery that mattered. But the records told a colder story. They showed gifts that were not fully disclosed, trademarks that kept arriving, hotel revenue that kept flowing, government ethics alarms that kept sounding, and a paper trail that did not collapse into one dramatic scandal because it was spread across many official ledgers. That was the trap. The mystery was not hidden in darkness. The mystery was hiding in plain sight, buried under filings, appendices, agency reports, disclosure ranges, and the kind of numbers most people never read twice. That was why the tone around Ivanka Trump's business history always sounded so polished right up until the paperwork entered the room. Once the paperwork entered, the glamour started to thin out. What had been sold as elegant diplomacy started looking more like a rolling conflict of interest stress test for the federal government. What had been presented as a modernizing daughter helping run a family empire began to look like a case study in how public office and private advantage can move dangerously close without ever needing a signed confession. And the deeper the records went, the worse the contradiction became because each document answered one question and opened three more. The first layer was image. She was marketed as disciplined, articulate, and polished enough to stand near the machinery of the presidency without appearing consumed by it. The second layer was structure. She entered government after years of running branded businesses tied to licensing, trademarks, hotel interests, consulting arrangements, and global visibility. The third layer was exposure. The moment those business interests crossed paths with foreign governments, public ethics law, diplomatic gifting rules, White House disclosure obligations, and lender scrutiny, the story stopped being about style and started being about systems. Systems create records. Records survive spin. And once those records are lined up next to each other, the claim that there was never a larger pattern becomes much harder to say with a straight face. That pattern did not begin with one explosive hearing clip. It began with the government's own disclosure architecture. Under the Foreign Gifts and Decorations Act, gifts above the minimum value are supposed to be reported. The White House compiles them. The State Department publishes them. General Services Administration procedures govern purchases if officials want to retain them. The rules are not ornamental. They exist because foreign gifts are never just gifts. They are tests of influence, records of access, and sometimes invitations disguised as courtesy. So when House Oversight Democrats released an interim staff report on March 17, 2023, the headline was not small. The report said the Trump White House failed to report more than 100 foreign gifts to the president and first family worth more than $250,000. It pointed to missing records, missing items, and a 2021 State Department Office of Inspector General report that found significant record-keeping and physical security problems in the Office of the Chief of Protocol. Then came the details, and the details were the kind that make broad denials feel flimsy. The report identified 16 unreported gifts to the Trump family from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates worth more than $45,000, including a Saudi dagger valued at up to $24,000 and two sword sets worth a combined $8,800. It identified 17 unreported gifts from India worth more than $47,000, including an $8,500 vase, a $4,600 model of the Taj Mahal, and $1,900 cufflinks. And the part that pulled Ivanka's name directly into the chain was even harder to ignore. The committee published a specific appendix for unreported foreign gifts received by Ivanka Trump and her children. That was not rumor. That was an official investigative release with appendices, dates, item descriptions, and statutory language. What made that moment more dangerous was not simply the dollar value, it was the institutional context. The same interim report stressed that GSA records showed Jared Kushner purchased and retained 5 Saudi gifts, including the dagger, and that the committee was still trying to determine the final disposition of certain other gifts. It also linked the foreign gifts problem to the Constitution's Foreign Emoluments Clause and to the Ethics in Government Act. That meant the issue had moved beyond optics. Once a congressional report starts connecting reporting failures, possible retained items, federal law, and constitutional boundaries, the defense can no longer rely on saying everything was ordinary. Ordinary transactions do not require investigators to reconstruct where government gifts went after an administration ends, and that was only one folder. The next folder was money, and money has a way of stripping away the last protective layer of branding. Crew's analysis of Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump's final financial disclosures reported that the couple disclosed receiving between $23,791,645 and $120,676,949 in combined outside income in the period covering 2020 through January 20th, 2021. Across their years in the White House, Crew estimated that they reported between $172 million and $640 million in outside income. The exact figure could not be known because federal disclosures use broad ranges, but even the low end was politically radioactive. It meant the sacrifice narrative collapsed on contact. Ivanka Trump's own hotel interest sharpened the point. In that final disclosure period, she reported $1,463,449 in hotel-related revenue from the Trump International Hotel in Washington. Crew also noted an unexplained drop in the reported value of her stake from a prior range of $5 million to $25 million down to just $100,001 to $250,000. No corresponding sale was disclosed. That kind of change does not answer questions, it creates them. If a valuable interest collapses on paper without a disclosed transaction, anyone reading carefully starts wondering whether valuation, structure, timing, or reporting conventions are doing the heavy lifting. And once people start wondering that, the script of inevitability begins writing itself. The consulting payments raised another set of questions. Crew reported that Ivanka had arranged fixed guaranteed annual payments designed to avoid having an active stake in certain entities while serving in government. Those figures were supposed to be straightforward: $100,000 from T International Realty LLC, $800,000 from TTT Consulting LLC, and $600,000 from TTT Venture LLC. Yet the final report showed only $362,500 from TTT Consulting and an extra $62,500 from TTT Venture. Maybe there was an explanation, maybe there was a timing issue, but uncertainty inside a supposedly stabilizing ethics arrangement is exactly the kind of thing that turns a compliance story into an accountability story. Then there was the business that allegedly closed but somehow never stopped talking through its income lines. Crew found that in her 2019 financial disclosures, Ivanka Trump reported making between $100,000 and $1 million in rent or royalties from the Ivanka M. Trump Business Trust, even though the business had previously reported that all operations ceased on July 31, 2018. The trust still held trademarks, fragrances, jewelry, handbags, eyewear, and other brand assets. In ordinary language, that meant the brand could be pronounced dead in public while still earning money in the background. That is not the kind of detail that ends a controversy. That is the kind of detail that convinces an audience the controversy was never fully explained to begin with. And just when the money trail seemed complicated enough, the trademark trail pushed the story overseas again. Crew reported that Ivanka Trump Marks LLC applied for 2 Japanese trademarks on November 9, 2016, the day after Donald Trump won the election. Those trademarks were approved on February 2nd and February 16th, 2018, around the time Vice President Mike Pence visited Japan and met Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Crew also noted that Abe had met Ivanka shortly after those applications were filed. This did not prove a corrupt trade, but ethics law does not wait for cinematic proof. It reacts to intersections, incentives, and appearances that are corrosive even when they stay just outside a criminal box. The broader foreign trademark pattern was even harder to dismiss as coincidence. Crew reported that Ivanka's business won Chinese trademark approvals while she was in the White House, including approvals that landed around major administration moves involving ZTE. In all, Crew said at least 28 foreign trademarks were approved for Ivanka Trump while she worked in the administration. That is the kind of statistic that changes the room. One trademark can be brushed off as routine. 28 begins to sound like a map of opportunity drawn across multiple jurisdictions, while the owner sat inside one of the most powerful political households in the world. And there was still another file waiting on the edge of the table because international business concerns did not end with trademarks and disclosures. In March 2018, reporting cited by The Hill said FBI counterintelligence officials were scrutinizing one of Ivanka Trump's business deals related to the Trump International Hotel and Tower in Vancouver, a 16-foot development opened in February 2017 and associated with Ju Kim Tia, heir to one of Malaysia's wealthiest families. The report said it was not clear what aspect of the deal investigators were examining, while noting that investigators look at whether business relationships could create pressure points from foreign agents. It also noted that President Trump's financial disclosure had revealed at least $5 million in royalties from the project, along with thousands in management fees. Again, not a conviction, but definitely not nothing. That mattered because the public defense usually relied on a thin distinction between legality and concern. If there was no indictment, allies treated that like an exoneration. But that is not how ethics exposure works. Ethics exposure accumulates through unresolved overlaps between power, money, foreign governments, lenders, and selective distance from inconvenient paperwork. Each individual line can look survivable in isolation. Put together, they start resembling a stress fracture spreading through an entire narrative of innocence. The courtroom chapter made that fracture visible. On November 8, 2023, Ivanka Trump testified in the New York civil fraud trial that she worked on deals but was not privy to her father's personal financial statements beyond seeing a few documents and pieces of correspondence. She portrayed the family business as having over-delivered on major projects and kept distance from the statements at the center of the Attorney General's allegations. Yet the same reporting described her as the point person in establishing a lending relationship with Deutsche Bank's private wealth management arm, which extended the Trump Organization hundreds of millions of dollars in loans requiring Donald Trump's annual financial statements. The defense sounded careful. The surrounding facts sounded less forgiving. That was where the moral compression hit. Because the public is asked again and again to believe two things that do not sit comfortably together. It is asked to believe that a senior advisor deeply involved in major projects, foreign-facing branding, lender relationships, and White House visibility was central enough to help drive the family's global business image, but peripheral enough to remain outside the critical financial representations that sustain the empire's borrowing power. It is asked to believe the business closed, yet the money kept arriving. It is asked to believe foreign trademarks arriving during government service were routine, foreign gifts missing from disclosure were bureaucratic noise, and unexplained valuation shifts were just paperwork. At some point, the explanation stops sounding like sophistication and starts sounding like insulation. That is the real significance of the records. They do not need to prove one mythical hidden account to devastate the cleaner public story. They only need to prove a recurring pattern in which public responsibility and private benefit traveled side by side, separated by technicalities, timing, and layers of corporate form. The audience waiting for one cartoonishly obvious smoking gun misses the more serious lesson. Modern influence rarely arrives as a signed confession. It arrives as overlapping advantages documented across agencies that do not always speak in the same voice but still point in the same direction. So the final question is not whether one dramatic phrase can capture everything. It is whether the official record already says enough. More than 100 unreported foreign gifts, more than $250,000 in value. Specific appendices naming Ivanka Trump and her children, at least 28 foreign trademarks approved while she served in the White House, a final disclosure period showing more than $1.4 million in hotel-related revenue. A previously reported stake value dropping from as high as $25 million to as low as $100,001 without a disclosed sale. A brand said to be shut down still producing up to $1 million in royalties. A Canadian hotel project reportedly scrutinized by counterintelligence officials. Hundreds of millions in loans linked to a lender relationship in which she was directly involved. Those are not vibes. That is a stack. And stacks are dangerous because they do not argue. They sit there, they wait, they force the same problem every time a polished defense tries to outrun the paperwork. If nothing was wrong, why were there so many missing disclosures, so many amendments, so many unexplained shifts, so many ethics concerns spread across gifts, trademarks, royalties, lenders, and foreign-facing assets? If everything was standard, why did the official story so often require the public to stop reading right before the appendices began? That was the collapse hiding inside the elegance, not a theatrical outburst, not a single shouted confession, just the slow suffocation that happens when every new document makes the old reassurance sound less believable. By the end, the problem was no longer one allegation or one headline. The problem was institutional density. Congressional investigators had one part, ethics watchdogs had another, financial disclosures had another, court testimony added another. Each piece was incomplete by itself. Together, they formed the outline of a political business model that kept asking the public for trust while generating record after record that invited doubt. That is why the story does not end with a denial. It ends with a ledger. It ends with official reports, disclosure ranges, agency findings, trademark records, loan relationships, and courtroom distance that never quite closes the gap. It ends with a public figure trying to stand above the paperwork while the paperwork keeps rising around her ankles. It ends with the simplest and hardest conclusion in Washington. Influence does not always need to be hidden to be dangerous. Sometimes it only needs to be normalized long enough for people to stop noticing how much the record already reveals. The record did reveal it. The appendices revealed it, the disclosures revealed it, the testimony revealed it. And once all of it is seen together, the old claim that there was nothing there stops sounding like a defense at all. That future fallout is the part seasoned operators fear most because once one oversight file becomes publicly legible, every adjacent institution starts rereading its own records with fresh suspicion. Treasury ethics officials look at disclosure timing, congressional staff look at appendices and purchase logs, State Department custodians look at gift inventories and missing disposition forms. Reporters pull older filings and notice the contradictions they missed the first time. Opponents stop arguing about motive and start arguing about sequence. Sequence is lethal in a scandal because it turns scattered controversies into chronology. First came the applications, then the approvals, then the meetings. First came the public shutdown, then the continuing royalties. First came the prestige of public office, then the private benefits still moving underneath it. First came the claim of distance, then the testimony confirming involvement in deals, lender relationships, and project development. None of those steps needs to prove a criminal conspiracy to damage credibility. They only need to establish that the public was repeatedly asked to accept improbably neat separations inside an enterprise built on overlapping names, entities, and leverage. That is how reputations begin to fail in Washington. Not always through a verdict, but through accumulation. Not always through one explosive tape, but through a boring pile of documents that all bend in the same direction. Once that happens, every future speech, every interview, every reinvention attempt meets the same silent cross-examination. If the boundaries were so clean, why did the record look so messy? Why did the explanations keep changing shape while the paper trail kept getting longer? And why did accountability only seem urgent after investigators, watchdogs, and courts had already done the reading for everyone else? That is when a polished brand stops functioning as armor and starts functioning as evidence, because every staged appearance reminds viewers that the unresolved question was never competence alone. It was whether power and profit were ever separated. The audience can call it ethics drift, foreign influence risk, disclosure failure, branding conflict, institutional negligence, or a family business culture that never learned where private gain was supposed to stop. The label is secondary now. The sequence is what matters. The gifts surfaced, the trademarks surfaced, the hotel money surfaced, the lender relationships surfaced, the courtroom distancing surfaced, and with each new layer, the gap between image and record grew too large to hide inside polished language. That was the exposure. That was the accountability callback presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.